For the AP exam, you need to know that the Native American people who lived in North America were thriving before the arrival of the Europeans. That's what Key Concept 1.1 is all about. Key Concept 1.2 is about what happens when those Native American societies come into contact with European explorers. It says, contact among Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans resulted in the Columbian Exchange and significant social, cultural, and political changes on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Let's start with why the Europeans were exploring in the first place. There are a lot of reasons that the Spanish and Portuguese kicked off this whole craze of European exploration. Most of them were eager to find a trade route to India or China, but some of them were just really excited by the new navigation and shipbuilding technologies that let them do this in the first place. The best way to think about exploration during this time period is that thing you learned in the 3rd grade: God, gold, and glory. Those were their 3 motives. Some people were motivated by a desire to spread religion or to escape religious persecution. And that's why we can say that God was one of the motives that brought people to the New World. Some people came because they wanted to start a new business. They wanted to mine gold and silver. They wanted to trade with India and Asia. And so we can say that gold was another motive that brought people to the New World. Finally, we can say that glory was a motive. Some people wanted to bring glory to their family name, or to the Catholic Church, or to their own countries. And as they did that, they could bring prestige to these increasingly growing empires. So God, gold, and glory is a simple way to remember the motives that brought Europeans to the New World. As Europeans began settling in the New World, they started fighting over territory. All these rivalries formed between Spain and Portugal. They fought over Brazil and South America, and France and England, who fought primarily over North America. So the conquest of the New World began to change the rules of the game in Europe. Wars started, empires grew. The British and Dutch, for example, started making new companies. They're called joint stock companies. These are kind of like the first stocks in world history. Basically, the idea was, if I'm going to send my ship to the New World and it could sink, well, that's a lot of risk. So I'll sell stocks. There'll be 80 or 100 people who send a ship, and we can distribute the risk. And that really drove expansion, that drove a lot of the investment in the New World. Now, the key concept talks about something called the Columbian Exchange. And this is something you need to remember. When we say Columbian Exchange, we're talking about the transfer of crops and animals, diseases, and even people from the Old World to the New World and vice versa. When Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, Europeans had never seen a tomato or a potato or a piece of corn. And Europeans introduced all sorts of plants and animals into the New World, including wheat, rice, horses, grapes, and coffee. Stuff that we almost associate with the Americas actually comes from Europe, Africa, and Asia. Most importantly, though, Europeans brought with them all kinds of diseases, terrible ones like measles and smallpox and influenza. And these diseases destroyed the native populations of the Americas. Some scholars have estimated that between 80 to 95% of all Native Americans died in the 1500s because of these diseases that were part of the Columbian Exchange. Now, the final part of the Columbian Exchange you need to know is the slave trade. What happened was Europeans began basically overusing Native American labor. Native Americans began dying in large numbers from diseases, so they turned to Africa and took over the slave trade that existed there to ship Africans into the New World. Now, the Spanish were particularly advanced in the slave trade. They were looking for lots of labor because they developed something called the Encomienda System. Basically, they promised Spanish people, if you move to the New World, we'll give you a bunch of slaves. And that started out as Native Americans, but as I said, they began suffering and dying in large numbers. So literally, they just turned to Africa and brought in more bodies. That's brutal. The key concept mentions there's significant social, cultural, and political changes on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, there's a lot to say here, but one of the major things that you want to keep in mind is how different Europeans and Americans really were from each other. The Native Americans were very confused by what they found in European customs and traditions, and vice versa. Almost all the sources we read are marked by this kind of confusion. But we also see exploitation. Europeans took over native lands, they began to enslave native peoples, and they started justifying this with these elaborate ideas from religion and racial superiority. Now, Native Americans didn't just take this, right? They tried to defend their traditional values and customs and define their own political freedom. As you think about period 1 then, think about key concept 1.1 as the positive half of the story. It's about expansion and diversity and really interesting, thriving societies. But when you think about key concept 1.2, the story takes a dark turn. That's when Native American peoples come in contact with Europeans and they begin losing land. They die of disease and starvation and warfare. We have slaves coming in over from Africa. That's what this is all about. It's the Columbian Exchange that defines the European exploitation of the Americas. Those are the two key concepts that make up period one.